Most historians of the Revolutionary War in the South argue that it began with the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge in February of 1776. Not true. It began here, right here. This was the flashpoint for the Revolutionary War in North Carolina, right here at Fort Johnston. Now, it's not a very well-known episode in the history of North Carolina at that time. But the Patriots, and really they called themselves Whigs, W-H-I-G-S, which of course was an English political party as opposed to the Tories, who were the Loyalists. But we all grew up calling them Patriots, American Patriots. But the Loyalists thought of themselves as Patriots too, Patriots to the King. So it gets a little complicated, but I'm going to call them Patriots because, well, we're American Patriots. The Patriots descended on Fort Johnston to occupy the place when the deposed last royal governor of North Carolina, after leaving the capital at New Bern, came to Fort Johnston and established it as his place of residence, but also as a base of operations for things to come. But what happened in North Carolina would be as a result of what happened here at Fort Johnston. All right, now, since the late summer of 1774, as you know, there really was a growing anti-government movement in all of the colonies, centered mostly in Boston and Massachusetts. But the dissenters had made an effort in the pre-war years to enlist as many of the colonies to support the growing movement. Now, do not think of this as an independence movement. There was no interest in independence until the cost of the war, both the human cost and the financial cost, became untenable. So don't even think about it being a war for independence until 1776. But it would become a war for independence as a result of what happened here in 1775. So the dissenters were meeting as a provisional Congress, which was an extra-legal assembly, as opposed to the General Assembly that, of course, was controlled by the royal governor, Josiah Martin. And many of the same members of the General Assembly were meeting to discuss the growing anti-government movement, while at the same time serving in the General Assembly in support of the governor. As a result of these meetings, in all of the colonies really, there was a call for a general meeting of the colonies, which of course was the Continental Congress, the first one being held in September and October of 1774 in Philadelphia. Only Georgia did not send representatives to the meeting. And of course, what they did there was to affirm, and early on, but to establish solidarity with the other colonies, that we will have a non-importation, we will not export to Great Britain, and it will also be time to establish committees of safety and committees of correspondence. And the committees of safety were district and community governments of sorts, sort of quasi-governments that increasingly will take over political affairs in each of the towns and the counties. But they also called for local militia units to organize, to meet more often, and to train, not for an offensive war, but for a defensive war. Now, gentlemen, all of us would have served in a militia unit. This predated the National Guard and the State Guard. Every community in every colony would have had militia units that would be called out at times of emergency, whether that be an attack by a foreign foe or a slave uprising. In fact, that was part of the intention of these militia units, was to, quote, maintain social order, which meant keeping African Americans suppressed. And all of us, it would have been compulsory, as it is in Israel, you have to join the military, and we would have. But early on, it was more fraternal and social. You'd get together, you would drink, you would have a turkey shoot, you'd fire off your muskets and pretend to train a little bit. But as the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies deteriorated after the French and Indian War, then they started to get more serious about it. And so that's what the Continental Congress in part was calling for. And our local representative to the Continental Congress was William Hooper, a Boston lawyer who moved to Wilmington in 1764. He would be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And he lived at 2nd and Princess Street in downtown Wilmington. There he is. And when British occupied the area in 1781, they really wanted that guy. That guy and Cornelius Harnett, who was the Samuel Adams of North Carolina. The man, not the beer, although they probably drank Samuel Adams beer too. I always thought there should be an IPA Cornelius Harnett beer in the area. That would go over very well. Now, at that time, there were 30 counties. They established 6 military districts. There would be an officer that would be chosen by the committees of safety, who would be the commander of that military district, and then he was responsible for organizing the militia units to prepare for potential military operations. So, for example, in the Wilmington district, the leading commander was Alexander Lillington, who was from Harnett County today. The town of Lillington was named for him. In Craven County, or the New Bern district, it was Richard Caswell, for whom Fort Caswell was named, and he was our first state governor. So 6 of these military districts worked closely with each other. You had committees of correspondence. Of course, you couldn't pick up a cell phone or send a telegraphic message. It all had to be done overland or by sea through written correspondence. But that was very important. And increasingly, and I didn't know this, I'm a Civil War historian, but writing on Morris Creek Bridge, that was a Civil War battle. Little c, little w. And I'm going to come to that in just a moment. But what I didn't realize was the extent to which those who supported the growing anti-British government cause, and eventually the independence movement, the level or the extent to which they were going to use intimidation and the threats against others who were fence sitters or who were loyalists. And many of the loyalists throughout the colonies ended up leaving the area for safer havens, whether it be Nova Scotia or all the way to England, as John Burgoyne of the Burgoyne Wright House did. And so they forced you to sign a letter of association saying, I support the American cause. And they would do this by going to you and say, you're not showing up for the committees of safety meeting, and we're a little antsy about where your loyalties lie. So we want you to sign the document of association, and if you don't, we're going to boycott your store. And if that doesn't work, we're going to come back and we're going to seize your stock. And if that doesn't work, we're going to go to your farm or your plantation and we're going to seize your property, including your slaves. So they upped the ante as you went along to get this forced allegiance to the American cause. And that's why historians have such a difficult time trying to quantify loyalism in the colonies. You may have signed the letter of association and you may have espoused support for the American cause when in fact you were a supporter of the king. So you went underground, you kept quiet, you didn't say anything if your loyalties were with the king. Now that's, of course, going to come to a head with the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. And I'm going backwards. Now I'm going forwards. Now I don't know which way I'm going. Hang on. Okay. Now, our last royal governor was Josiah Martin. Things really reached a tipping point in May of 1774. He had already been dealing with this extra-legal Congress, provisional Congress that was meeting in New Bern, which was the colonial capital. He could feel the intensity of the anti-government movement growing, in part because of the tactics that the anti-government protesters and dissenters were using to get loyalty to the American cause. So on that particular day, May 23rd, a group of anti-government protesters show up on the door of Tryon Palace, where Martin lived. He was not expecting them to show up. Their leader was Abner Nash, a very eminent lawyer from New Bern, and they wanted to meet with him, but not expecting them. He told his secretary, "Tell the group that I can't see them." And then he learned that, well, it's just a group of loyal subjects who want to talk to you very briefly about a matter of some importance. And it turned out they wanted to know why Martin had dismounted the cannons in the yard of Tryon Palace, which were used for general defense and for celebrations and social occasions. And they thought that this was an effort to keep munitions and artillery from the hands of the people of North Carolina who owned the property. And Martin said, "No, it's not your property, it's the property of the king. And I didn't take or dismount the cannons to keep them out of your hands," wink, wink. "I took them down because the carriages, which are wood, are rotting. And we need to build new carriages so we can fire off the cannons in celebration of King George III's 37th birthday, which is only 10 days away." But in fact, he had removed them, and we have a report that he wrote to the colonial secretary in London. "I removed them because I thought these very same people were going to seize them." And he also ended up burying musket balls and gunpowder in the garden of Tryon Palace. But by this day, when they showed up, he realized that things were going to go south from that point on. And worrying about his own safety, and especially for that of his family, his wife Elizabeth, their children, he put them on a ship to be sent north to New York under British occupation. And Mrs. Martin, who they called Betsy, was glad to be going. Since they had arrived in New Bern in 1771, the pernicious vapors of the South, the heat, humidity, and the pernicious vapors had taken 2 of her children. And she was highly pregnant was the term at that time, I guess, as opposed to lowly pregnant. I think it probably meant that she was in the 3rd trimester. She was going to have another baby, and she was scared to death that the southern environment would take another one of her children. So she was glad to be going, and she's going north. But Martin did not want to give up complete control of of his colony. He didn't want to abandon his loyal supporters in New Bern, but he just thought the best part of valor here is to move my residence and my base of operations from New Bern, and the best place to go is the mouth of the Cape Fear River, where there is the only serviceable British fort and the only garrison fort, Fort Johnston. And so that's what he did. He had already requested from General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in America, muskets and musket balls, munition, supplies to be sent from Boston to New Bern, and was eagerly awaiting them, with which he thought that he could put down this growing rebellion. But the weapons never arrived. They were supposed to go to New Bern. He changed his base of operations, sent correspondence to General Gage. Don't send them to New Bern. Send them down to the mouth of the Cape Fear River because I'm going to be at Fort Johnston. So he took off, not traveling, as most historians have written, not by ship down the coast. He took a carriage from New Bern to Cross Creek, now Fayetteville, where he met with Highland Scott Loyalists. And then from there down to Fort Johnston. So we now know that he came by carriage. Fort Johnston, again, was the only serviceable fort. It was well armed with artillery. There were garrison troops here, not regular British forces with their crimson uniforms. These were provincial forces. So these were loyalists from Virginia, from North Carolina, from as far away as New York, who had joined the provincial army to serve on garrison duty, and as fate would have it, they ended up at Fort Johnston. But there are only a dozen of them. That's it. But that's the way that the fort looked initially, with bastions on the corner, and of course that was built right here. And this was the first fort in the colonies that was guarding the Cape Fear River and the towns of Brunswick and Wilmington. And it was absolutely crucial to protect the trade and the plantations, because as you know, we were peopled initially by very wealthy South Carolinians, the Moore family. And so they carried a lot of influence, a lot of power, and they wanted their property and their assets, not residual, their assets to be protected. And so pretty early on, they argued for having a fort, Fort Johnston, and you can see it's actually located almost 3 miles from the mouth of Old Inlet. And along with the soldiers that were here was His Majesty's sloop of war, the Cruiser. It was the only British ship on station on the Cape Fear River, and that's it. There was not a flotilla of vessels to protect trade here. And of course, by then, of course, the Lower Cape Fear had been settled for about 50 years. The first Charlestown in Carolina was on the Cape Fear River, as y'all know. It was about 17 miles up the Cape Fear River at Town Creek. That's why Town Creek is called that, because the first Charlestown in Carolina was here. And I love telling the blue bloods of Charleston, South Carolina, that the first Charlestown was on the Cape Fear River. In fact, I did a little tour this morning for a cruise ship, and they were going from here to Charleston. I said, well, when you get down there and you're taking a tour there tomorrow, as they'd planned, I said, be sure to tell them that that's not the first Charlestown. The first Charlestown was on the Cape Fear River in North Carolina. Well, you know, we've got the old adage in North Carolina that we live in the valley or the vale of humility, surrounded by 2 mountains of conceit. So it's fun to talk about that. The region was officially called Port Brunswick because Brunswick Town was the first enduring community on the Cape Fear River, at least from 1726 until the Revolutionary War. And Wilmington was founded just 6 years later, further upriver at the confluence of the Cape Fear and the Northeast Cape Fear rivers. And of course, the planters, we were land plenty and people poor. So there was lots of area for plantations. And that's what was established, rice plantations, and then of course, naval stores plantations. And so Wilmington became Brunswick's rival initially, and then Wilmington would become its grave digger, but that's another story for another meeting. What I found interesting was this plan as early as 1744 by then Governor Gabriel Johnston to build a defense for the protection of these very wealthy planters in the Lower Cape Fear. And so he formed a committee and said, okay, figure out a place to to build a fortification close to the mouth of the Cape Fear River, just in case the French or the Spanish or any of our foes, pirates, attempt to cross the bar and attack us. And the first location that they recommended was right across the river, Battery Island, which is where it got its name. There was never a battery there. They may have used it for target practice, but that's where Battery Island got its name, and it's still called that today, as you well know. So Johnston rejected that. He said, no, I think the better place would be up on the high ground, on the bluffs on the mainland side of the Cape Fear River. And so that's why Fort Johnston, named for Gabriel Johnston, was built with construction beginning about 1748, garrison troops here by about 1750, and the commander of Johnston's Fort, as it was originally called, and you'll see it on maps as Fort Johnson. It's not. It's named for Gabriel Johnston. Going the wrong way again. The commander here was Captain John Collette. Now, what was driving all of this anti-government sentiment? It was because of the changing policy with Great Britain with regard to American colonies. The French and Indian War had lasted 9 years. It was expensive. They now had a greatly expanded empire as a result of their victory over France and her ally Spain. We now had all the lands to the Mississippi River. Great Britain got Canada, India, other land holdings. So you've got to raise revenue to be able to manage the greatly expanded empire, pay down the war debt, and as you well know, then Great Britain changed its imperial economic policy and started raising fees. You never call them taxes. That's the death knell of a politician. Remember, Walter Mondale said, I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to raise your taxes. That was it. You knew he was going to lose the election right there. So these were fees, and you know, the Sugar Act, the Tea Act, and the most egregious one, the Stamp Act of 1765, which of course required everyone in the colonies to pay for a stamp that would be affixed to any printed document or buy documents that had the Crown's watermark on it. So it affected everyone. As you know, there were protests throughout the colonies, including here in the Lower Cape Fear. Just before the Stamp Act went into enactment on November the 1st, there was a mock funeral for liberty held in Wilmington, a whole big celebration where they took Liberty in a casket up to St. James Church's graveyard, and they were starting to bury her when someone thought that they heard a faint heartbeat, and they pulled her back out and opened up the casket, and Liberty still has a pulse. And Liberty was saved. And of course, that was just the beginning, but they made a big spectacle out of all of this, in part as a show of force and intimidation to anyone who might be loyal to the king. We are now gaining control. And those threats, or that intimidation, they realized was working. If not violence, the threat of violence was a way to meet your needs. Well, at the time, William Tryon, who, by the way, lived at Brunswick Town for 5 years, at Castle Tryon, Old Russellborough. He only lived in New Bern for 1 year. Had that magnificent palace built for him, named it Tryon Palace, and it's Tryon Palace, not Tryon's Palace. I've been corrected by New Bernites several times. It's Tryon Palace. He was there only 1 year. He lived at Brunswick Town for 5 years. And it was his reign when the Stamp Act occurred, and the colonists actually liked Tryon, and he tried to work with them, even offering to defray the cost of these stamps personally, and invited leaders of the anti-government movement into his house at Castle Tryon, got them full of port and sherry, and then, let's talk about this. But they were so intent on liberty and running their own affairs without government interference That was tyranny. And that's what they were fighting for. That they just told the governor, no. There will be problems if the Stamp Act is strictly enforced here. And when they showed up at his house, 500, 800, the numbers changed, but they were armed. This was armed resistance, the largest armed resistance to the Stamp Act in any of the 13 colonies happened at Brunswick Town. So the law and the crisis did subside when Parliament finally rescinded the Stamp Act in 1766. But radicalism in the Lower Cape Fear was strong enough that Governor Tryon felt anxious and worried that he left Brunswick Town and moved to New Bern. Now, it was the capital, but he was happy here. But that's what, in part, led him to move up to New Bern. Well, to reassert the Crown's authority in North Carolina, Governor Martin, who was Tryon's successor, proposed, and once he got to Fort Johnston, he proposed to the colonial secretary, a guy named Lord Dartmouth, look, I want to regain royal authority, royal control in my lost colony. See how I worked lost colony into that. But what I need are men and weapons. I've already requested weapons from General Gage in Boston, but they never arrived. So, sir, if you can work it out with the king, because the king had to approve of any of these kinds of measures, these military operations, big military operations, sir, if you will send me a brigade of British regular forces, and this is the finest fighting force in the world at the time. This is like the U.S. Marines. You want something done right, you get the Marines in. So you send British regulars. Send me a brigade of British regulars. Send me 10,000 British muskets, Brown Bess muskets, and ammunition, and I can raise a provisional army of upwards to 3,000 Highland Scot loyalists. The Scots had been coming here since the 1730s. And at the time of the Revolutionary War, there were as many as 15,000 Scots living in the Cape Fear Valley. And they established communities like Cross Creek and Campbellton, which are now Fayetteville, and Argyle, and Manchester, and Lancaster. And their loyalties were with the king, because to come to America and to get land grants, they had to swear an oath of allegiance to the king. And they were honor bound. Honor was a big deal among people in those days. They were honor bound to be loyal to the king. And so he believed that he could rely on them at a time that he might need them. And he told London, I know I can raise an army of thousands of these guys if you will support me with regular British forces and arms and ammunition. And there he is just telling Lord Dartmouth, if my hands were strengthened by the assistance of General Gage, I could do what I need to do. I don't care if the men and the weapons come from London or from Boston, but if I could get them, I could reestablish royal authority in North Carolina. Well, what a lot of historians don't point out is that other southern governors, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia, were making similar proposals to London of regaining control in their respective colonies as the anti-government movement is growing in strength and popularity. They were all making proposals. But King George supported Josiah Martin's. Why? Why did he? Virginia made much more sense logistically for military operations there, because you've got the wide entryway into Virginia by way of the Chesapeake Bay. Cape Fear River is very narrow. Down in Charleston, it's much more accessible than is the Cape Fear. So why did King George III decide to come and support this one? What do I do with my water? There it is. Yeah. Excuse me 1 second. I've gotten cotton mouth. We should say naval stores mouth down here. Okay, so that's what Martin is requesting once he has established his residence and his base of operations at Fort Johnston. Now, he tried to keep his appearance here a secret, but within about 10 days, everyone in North Carolina knew where he was. Deserters from the garrison, disaffected loyalists, they let the secret out. And in response, the American patriots organized, I call them Liberty Boys, organized and then tried to prevent anyone from meeting or corresponding with Governor Martin at Fort Johnston. And he grew so concerned because there was also a rumor that there was a kidnapping plot to get him. There was a very strong rumor that the patriots believed that he planned for the arms, once they got here, to be given to enslaved people. And nothing struck more fear in the hearts of white Southerners than a slave insurrection. And so is that why Martin requested the arms and ammunition? That was patriot propaganda, misinformation, disinformation, but it worked. It worked. And it also helped support the growing anti-government movement. So Martin grew so concerned about his personal safety and that of his servants and other loyalists, leading loyalists, that he took refuge on the cruiser just offshore. And this was a small sloop of war. And suddenly there are people literally hanging over the gunwales and off the rigging to seek safety on board the cruiser. So there Martin has gone from Fort Johnston over to the cruiser for safety reasons. Now, loyalists in the area kept the governor apprised of the patriot activity. And the same was true with the American patriots. They were still supplying the garrison at Fort Johnston and the officers and crew on the cruiser with food and water and sundry supplies that were coming out of Brunswick Town or Wilmington. And once they had their ears on board the vessels, they were picking up information. So it was a very interesting unfolding situation. Now, by mid-July, these Liberty Boys were met at Brunswick Town, which is just 10 miles up the shoreline. Their plan was, and this is what Martin feared, we're not going to try to kidnap the governor, but we want to occupy Fort Johnston. That has become his base of operations. And now we understand that he's requested muskets and munitions and who knows what else to arm the people in the Lower Cape Fear, if not enslaved people. So what we need to do is deny him his base of operations at Fort Johnston. So that was the plan when they met by mid-July of 1775 at Brunswick Town. And they came from New Hanover County, from Bladen County, Brunswick County, of course. This was a well-organized army that was going to occupy Fort Johnston, seize the cannons and anything that would be of use to them. So keep that in mind. One of the leaders of this was Robert Howe, who owned Kendall Plantation and other property in Brunswick County. Also Cornelius Harnett, the Samuel Adams of the South, and some of the Moors. They were the leader. John Ash was one of the leaders of this movement. And so they organized these guys, and the plan, as I said, was to go down to the fort, occupy it, a show of force to the governor, who's just going to be on the cruiser right offshore, and seize the cannons that were here at the fort. Captain John Collette, who was the commander of the garrison here, wrote to General Gage, "If anything happens before help from you arrives, I'll make the most of a bad game." But it didn't look like that help would arrive, at least not anytime soon. So, July 18th, Governor Martin held his last meeting of his executive council, and only 3 members showed up, including Louis Derazet. If you know the Derazet house in Wilmington. They showed up for the meeting on the cruiser, and that was his last executive council meeting. And later that night, a Cape Fear River pilot named Nathan Adams came aboard with permission and handed Governor Martin a letter from the people that told him of their plans. Please do not be offended. We are not trying to suggest that we are not loyal subjects. We just want to occupy Fort Johnston for the safety and security of the fort and its weaponry until such time as it is needed. So that was the language that they used, when in fact they were increasingly concerned that this was a haven for escaped slaves. And they were losing slaves. Slaves were escaping in all this turmoil during the crisis. They were leaving farms and plantations and seeking safety with the cruiser and any other British ship that came and went at the port. And now there's a rumor that slaves are being held at Fort Johnston or have sought safety at Fort Johnston, and they're the very ones that Martin plans to arm when the weapons arrive. And so that was the other reason for coming here, was to get their property back. Well, shortly after 2:30, early on the morning of July 19th, an officer on board the cruiser bangs on the door of Captain Francis Perry's cabin, where Governor Martin is staying, to report that Captain Collette's house is on fire. And they quickly dressed, ran topside, and then watched the whole scene unfold with growing anger as one building after another, the arsonists lit a fire. And within a matter of about an hour, the entire fort was on fire and burned all night. It was still burning after dawn. Now, wait a minute. Wasn't the plan just to seize and occupy the fort? What had happened when they got to Fort Johnston that the Patriots decided to change their plans? Well, the British had taken all of the small arms, the muskets, off to the cruiser. They had dismounted all the cannons from their carriages and placed them down along the riverfront under the covering fire of the weapons of the cruiser. And they found some slaves here. So they said, Plan B. We're no longer just going to occupy the fort, we're going to destroy it, because it's clear that this is going to be his base of operations for military operations in North Carolina. He's going to enlist the wretched, deluded people of the interior, meaning the Highland Scots. So they burned it. They burned it to the ground. And Governor Martin, in his report to London, was livid, absolutely infuriated. He did not respond. Number one, he didn't have the manpower or the weaponry to respond effectively. And if he sent Marines ashore to deal with the arsonists and they got into a shooting match, that might spark war in North Carolina. So he sort of maintained his composure, but when he wrote to the colonial secretary, he said, to the last degree violent, extravagant, and provoking. He did not retaliate to the proceedings, as he called it. And surprisingly, after his fort had been destroyed, and by the way, there was this first wave that came in after midnight from Brunswick Town on July 19th. And then after sunrise, you got a group from Bladen County that arrive who have answered the clarion call for militia to come to the area to occupy Fort Johnston. They show up in a second wave and they destroy everything that had not been destroyed in the darkness, because there were some structures that did not burn because they didn't know they were there. Guard houses, sentry houses, and so forth. So everything was completely destroyed by about noon on July the 19th. But then kind of this normalcy returned to the area. The Admiralty Court was still being held in Brunswick Town. There was still trade going on between the cruiser and the people in town. It was a weird kind of simmering issue going on here, but they tried to return to normalcy as much as they possibly could. The Patriots received the thanks from committees of safety throughout North Carolina, especially from Wilmington, and some of the very members of the Committee of Safety who wrote this letter of appreciation were members of the group that destroyed Fort Johnston, so they're thanking themselves. And they wrote with such great alacrity, with speed and resolution. The officers and soldiers gave their attendance to effect a matter of so much real importance to the public. And then the Wilmington Committee of Safety and the members who were part of the arsonist group received letters from New Bern and from Edenton. Again, a show of solidarity among the communities and districts throughout the colony, which was very, very important. So one of my questions is, what the hell do they think they were doing when they attacked and destroyed Fort Johnston? Forgive my French. I am French after all. Fonvielle. Did they not consider that the Crown was going to respond to this blatant bellicose act of violence to the King's property? Now keep in mind that the people that destroyed it argued that no, it's not the property of the King, it's our property. The construction was paid for with our internal taxes through the General Assembly. You see how the minds of the colonists are starting to change, and they think that they, of course, have inalienable rights as Englishmen, but they also, by the 1750s, considered themselves different, special. They were becoming American. And they truly believe this. And now they are fighting for their liberty, for their rights. And if this is what it's going to take, we are willing to use that. Not just the threat of violence, Stamp Act, but now through violence. And we are going to achieve our means. And part of that came out of that Stamp Act resistance 10 years before. They had accomplished their mission through the threat of violence. Now let's ratchet it up one and see how the Crown responds to violence. And, well, you know how the Crown is going to respond. It is the reason that King George III approved of Josiah Martin's plan to organize an army of loyalists, and supported by British regular forces, would invade North Carolina by way of the Cape Fear River. And once they had reasserted royal authority in North Carolina, they would go south into South Carolina and then north into Virginia. But again, the other Southern governors were saying, we can do it better logistically in Virginia or Charleston. Why go to the Cape Fear? Because of what happened right here on July 19th, 1775. The King was going to retaliate against the North Carolinians who had so blatantly destroyed his property. And now it's payback time. It is retribution. And so that changed the whole picture. That's why this burning, this firebombing became so important. This was the flashpoint for war in North Carolina that would lead to the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge the following February. So, the historical landscape has changed, but the memory of what happened here should always stay with us. And we're getting ready to commemorate the 250th, and I guess we should be very proud of what happened here. What Morris Creek Bridge did in the end, because this is the prelude to Morris Creek, right? Had Fort Johnston not been burned, the king probably would have launched a southern campaign through Virginia, maybe South Carolina. But again, because of what happened here, the southern campaign would be launched in North Carolina. And that was absolutely crucial. And that changed everything. That led to the Battle of Morris Creek Bridge. And the Patriot victory at Morris Creek led to the North Carolina Provincial Congress passing 6 weeks after Morris Creek the Halifax Resolves, April 12th, 1776. And what are the Halifax Resolves? Anybody? There will be a written test after this presentation. Where do you see the date? Every day.
License plate.
Huh?
License plate. And then on our
License plate, but more importantly, have we got one hanging up? Yeah, it's on the flag. It's on our flag. That's how important that date was. On that date, when the Continental or the North Carolina Provincial Congress met in Halifax, North Carolina, passed unanimously the Halifax Resolves, the committee chaired by Cornelius Harnett, it instructed North Carolina's delegates, including William Hooper, Richard Caswell, Joseph Hughes from Edenton, vote in favor of independence at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776. We were first in freedom. We put it in writing. Other colonies had made verbal commitments to independence, but we were the first to put it in writing. And that's why when you go to the DMV, you can get a license plate that says first in freedom, first in flight, or first in freedom, because we were first in freedom. Now, I think the Delaware license plate says the same thing because they were the first to ratify the Constitution, 1788. But go back more than a dozen years. We were the first. We were the first. And we Americans like being number one. And we were number one because of what happened where we are sitting tonight. Well, I'm standing, you're sitting. Okay, that is it. Thank you all very much. I've enjoyed talking with you.